This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Here's your host, Brandon Contes.
Alrighty, welcome to episode 78 of the Awful Announcing Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Contes, and this week we are joined by Sports Illustrated's Chris Mannix, who last week had one of the biggest sports media profiles of the year on Adrian Wojnarowski. Chris, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. I, like everyone who read that check-in with Woj last week, I thought it was an excellent read. How was the response to that piece? Were you surprised by the response, or was it what you expected?
It was pretty big, and I wasn't all that surprised.
Yeah.
I think that there's always a fascination with sports media figures, and Adrian is one of the biggest ever, right? Given his platform and what he did with that platform. And I still think there were some outstanding questions about why he decided to walk away from ESPN. And I think in that piece, we kind of answered a lot of them, whether it was the, expanding on, why he felt kind of ground down from years of covering the NBA and the way that he did, to the health issues that I articulated there, to, what his life is like and what it means for him to be at St. Bonaventure. I mean, the way the story began with him, in that apartment above a bar is really remarkable. He has come complete full circle and is now, living above the old bar he used to go to, with, not roommates necessarily, but people who live next door that are athletes on the respective teams. It really is a full circle moment for him.
Yeah, that $1,500 apartment. The fact that he's living in a $1,500 apartment, I think, might have been the most shocking thing in that piece to me. Like, at first, I would have thought that this was a job that when he initially took it, that it would have been something that maybe he tried to do remotely. But if he's not going to do it remotely, I certainly wouldn't have guessed that $1,500 apartment. And I'm a big proponent of not living above your means, but we all know Woj can comfortably afford something a little bit more lavish. Did you see?
I don't know what. Oh, I saw it. Yeah, I spent a little bit of time up there. He's got the outdated microwave. He's got the appliances that aren't new. On his wall is a St. Bonaventure flag, like everything you and I probably had in our college dorms.
Yeah,
it's there. It looks like a typical college apartment. Like the furniture looks. I don't think it is IKEA, but it looks IKEA. And it's very sparsely overall furnished. In the video that we did, we kind of took people on a tour of the apartment, and one of the seats at his table is a booth that was lifted from the bar downstairs. So he's got it's every bit the college apartment that you would expect, and it's just exactly what he wants. Like, he wants to be within close proximity to the students, to the campus, to everything that's going on at St. Bonaventure. It's definitely not a remote job. He's at every single home game, and a lot of days in between when he's not at home games, he's on the road, scouting, junior college kids and high school kids, and even going over to Europe to look at some prospects that might be in kind of that St. Bonaventure range. So, he's thrown himself in with both feet into this new job.
I know you wrote that you're friends with Woj. Did you learn a lot about him when writing this piece? Like, did you already know about the $1,500 apartment, the health issues, the Kamala Harris's campaign wanting him to break her VP pick, or did you learn a lot of that stuff when writing this?
I would say I knew most of it. I didn't know really the depths of it, right? Like, just how, like, for example, the workload. Like, over the last couple of years, as his friend and someone that works in the business with him, like, I knew it was starting to wear him down some.
Yeah.
I knew there was going to be an expiration date on his career that was not going to be 10 years into the future. I didn't know it was going to be this quickly, and I didn't really know just how much it was starting to wear on him, just missing out on all the kind of family things you have to miss out on to do that job. I mean, just the day-to-day stuff, some of the stuff that I wrote about, kind of, just a family movie night. You've got to leave to break like Evan Mobley's contract extension. Like it's just these little things just started to kind of pile up. And eventually just kind of broke him down. The health stuff, I knew about it. I didn't know all the details about it, and I tried to get as many of them out there as humanly possible. So, I didn't know the extent of his health concerns, but most of the stuff I did know. The Kamala Harris thing was interesting. Like we did the whole reporting of the story over like 3 days up in Olean, and over the course of the next week, I'd call him and fact check a whole bunch of different things and make sure I get this right, that right. And during one fact check session, he's like, I just thought of something. He gave me the Kamala Harris thing. Like the story was effectively written. Like I had already done like 3,000 words in the story. He's like, I got this note from Kamala Harris or from one of her people, and they want me to break the story. I didn't put this in the story, but he actually, because he didn't know it was going to be Tim Walz, right? Like they wouldn't tell him who the VP pick was. So what he did was create 3 graphics that, breaking news, breaking from Woj, the typical ESPN stuff you see up there, 3 graphics with the 3 front runners for it.
Yeah.
Mark Kelly was on that list. Tim Walz was on that list. And Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania was on that list. So we had 3. He sent me the graphics. I have them on my phone. Like, there's 3 ready to go for when he was going to get the information and was allowed to tweet about it. But somebody, I think it was CNN, somebody broke it before he could get there.
How willing was he to take part in this profile? Like, did you have to convince him, or was he eager to open up and talk as much as he did?
Yeah, I didn't have to convince him at all, really. After he announced his retirement, I texted him and said, "Hey, man, all the best, all the stuff, normal things friends would do, colleagues would do." Then I gave it a few weeks to kind of settle. I'd been talking to my editors at SI about this story. I'm like, this is a good one. This will generate interest. I'm going to give it some breathing room, and then I'm going to go back to him. And I did go back to him a few weeks later, and he was quick to respond with yes. I know he had some interest from other people to do something similar, but I think our relationship helped with that. Obviously, I worked with him for a couple of years at Yahoo when he launched the vertical, and we've known each other for the better part of the last 20 years. So I think that certainly helped move this thing along. But once we started talking, there was nothing off limits. There was nothing he didn't want to talk about. At various times when discussing his health, he did get emotional talking about it, because even though it is, something that, as he says, he'll be fine. He's got control over. It's not something that would be deemed life-threatening at the moment. It's not something he's even getting treatment for at the moment. It's still cancer, and it's still something in your body that you didn't know about before. And as I wrote in the story, like, the doctor that he went to said, you can have surgery, but the only reason to have surgery now is if mentally you cannot handle the idea of having cancer in your body. And I'm sure a lot of people have that feeling. I might have that feeling. Even if I knew there was nothing that was going to change physically, I might want to say, get it out of me, no matter what. So there were various times he got emotional, talking about that, but talking to him, spent some time talking to his wife, Amy, as well. It was definitely hard to talk about at times, but he was always open about everything that was going on.
What was your reaction or surprise level when he did announce his retirement from the news industry, at least? It was,
if I had to rate it out of 10, it was probably 8 out of 10. Woj and I have the same agent at CAA. So I had, there was some, we're on a text chain and, we screw around, messing with about agent stuff. So I kind of had an inkling that it was being talked about, right? Like, but ultimately I kind of thought like, we're already into September. He'll do another year and maybe we'll figure it out later. But again, as he said, like he probably would have done that other year if this St. Bonaventure job didn't exist. And the reality is he had been doing that job, pretty much for an entire year, like, or more. Like he had been doing the bulk of that work from the NBA Today desk or from his house in New Jersey without even being there. And the opportunity to take on that job full time and to try to keep St. Bonaventure in the mix as a top school in that Atlantic 10, that was the driver right there. That's what pushed him, I think, into thinking about retirement to actually retiring.
You wrote that that Woj revolutionized what it means to be a reporter. How did he do that?
I mean, just harnessing Twitter, I think, is the first and foremost. What was Twitter before Woj started to push news out there onto it? What was the job before Woj started to make breaking news, exceedingly popular? And I think some people forget, before Woj was doing, was known as this newsbreaker, but he was a phenomenal columnist, still is a phenomenal columnist. That's why I expressed some surprise that he wasn't willing to kind of go back to ESPN on a lesser deal, go back to the kind of writing those biting columns that made him one of the top reporters in the game for a long time. He kind of got away from that since he went to ESPN in 2017, but that was always part of the backbone of what made him a great reporter. But revolutionizing is just, learning that we had this insatiable desire to know information as fast as humanly possible, knowing that, we wanted to know who the Indiana Pacers were going to draft 15 minutes before it was announced who they were going to draft. I mean, that type of job didn't exist before Adrian effectively created it.
Was it kind of right place, right time with Woj and social media, or was that crafted and deliberate?
I think it's a little bit of both. Even he didn't know what social media was going to do for him when he first started doing it. I referenced his first tweet back in, I think it was 2008 or 9, whatever it was, a couple of days before the draft, where he tweeted out, "This is the Twitter account of Adrian Wojnarowski and Johnny Ludden." Like, it was for the two of them over at Yahoo. So he just sort of used it. I would put it this way. I think he used it in the same way someone like Peter King used the internet early on. Like Peter King, who I worked with for a long time at SI, would write these long pieces in the magazine, but he would always have all this extra stuff from his notebook. SI.com comes along and Peter's like, all right, you know what? I'm just going to dump all this into a notebook, a long, long, long notebook, and let's see if people read it. Well, they did. They engaged with it. It made Peter an even bigger star than he already was. I think Woj used Twitter and harnessed Twitter kind of in the exact same ways. Like, I have this ability to get information, whether it's a day, an hour, minutes before. This is my outlet to use it, and this is what's gonna help me grow.
Yeah, no, that's a great parallel. Did you know Woj before he recruited you to the Vertical, or like what's the origin of your friendship?
Yeah, we were friendly when he started covering the NBA. I started covering the NBA, really 2003, 2004, but right around the same time, 2007, I think he went to Yahoo, was when I really started to get into it as a writer at SI. And we knew each other. We talked, I think it was around 2012 when I started getting some more TV gigs that I asked him, like, who represented him. And he told me it was Matt Kramer, who at the time was at CSE in Atlanta. And I just, from there I called Kramer and we started our working relationship. And, when he was assembling that team at the Vertical, he was looking for very specific people. He wanted to check a lot of boxes, right? Like, Michael Lee, who was a phenomenal long form writer, wrote like more feature type pieces. Bobby Marks, who was the front office insider. At that time, my strength was writing kind of those quick 1,000-word reaction columns with an opinion to them, kind of what he would often do, albeit on a much lesser level. He wanted me to kind of take over that responsibility while he and Shams did the breaking news. Gavoni and Schmitz did the draft stuff. So he wanted to check a lot of boxes, and I think that was why he recruited me, back in 2015.
How was that recruitment? Like, did it feel like a big risk leaving Sports Illustrated to join him?
It honestly, it did. And I'm not thinking back on it now. He offered me more money. It was a lot more money. I probably would have taken less money to stay at SI if they'd come up some, because I really liked working there. I really liked the people there. I'm like most people, like I'm about kind of the people I work with, right? Like, and at that time, Chris Stone was my editor. He went on to edit the LA Times. I mean, he was you'd run through a wall for that guy as your editor. Mark Bechtel, Stephen Cannella, who's now the editor at SI. Like, I liked working with these people, but the reality of the situation is, I mean, I think it's like an extra, $100,000 per year.
Okay.
And you can't, at that point in my life, I'm like, I'm not turning that down. Like, there's no way. So, he came hard and he came right. And, with the offer to go there, and I'll always be appreciative of that, of him having kind of a high level of confidence in me to do that job.
How was working with him?
It was great, man. I'm waiting for somebody to do like the oral history of the Vertical. Like, it was so short lived, but we had a pretty good staff there, man. Like, and we did some really good things. Like, in 2016, I think it was, when we did that first draft show. I mean, that was kind of revolutionary on the internet at the time. Nobody was doing that type of stuff. And we had, Woj and Shams, they had picks, sometimes we were like 6 or 7 picks ahead of the ESPN show. I remember executives from draft rooms texting me kind of the live stream of our show on their board, because they wanted to know in real time what was kind of going on out there. And we had a hell of a group there doing that. I mean, with Woj and Shams at Barclays doing their thing, Mike Schmitz, who I didn't know that well at the time, but I mean, the guy's like an encyclopedia of every draft pick you could ever want to know something about. We also had Tom Crean on that set, and Tom Crean, I think, did something that has not been done, was not done much before, and has not been done much. So Tom Crean would criticize. Like, if he didn't like somebody, he'd be like, that kid can't play. There was one pick, I think Denver picked, was it Tyler Lydon? Kid from Syracuse he picked, and is in the 20s. And Tom Crean sits up there. He's like, this kid's not good. This kid's not an NBA player. He's not going to make it. I remember the next day, Nuggets brass having to answer for Tom Crean's criticisms. I remember Jim Boeheim weighing in on Tom Crean's criticism. And you know what? Tom was right. I think the kid lasted a couple of years in the league and fizzled out. I always think there should be more of that, because if you think about it, how many of these draft picks pan out? What percentage of draft picks, first and second round, turn into players? It's too many times I turn on the TV and I'm seeing somebody talk about what a great pick this is. Most
and all the comps that the players they're compared to are always really solid, if not star NBA players. And that I just want one draft show where someone tells me why my pick is going to be terrible, why this team's pick is bad. I bet they're more right than wrong if they just take an entirely negative slant on all these guys. But Tom was great. Bobby was he was fresh out of the Nets front office, and he did an incredible job, on the touchscreen. I thought that draft show, which was within the first few months of the Vertical kind of being formed, I thought that draft show was really our coming out party. And that was a big moment for us, for Yahoo. And it really showed what we could do. And then, Adrian defects, goes to ESPN, and thus was the end of it. Did becoming more of an insider or newsbreaker ever appeal to you?
Not really. So I grew up in Boston, and my uncle was he's still alive, but he was the beat writer for the Patriots for the Boston Herald for 30 years. His name's Kevin Mannix, and he covered the beat and really was one of the originators of the report card column, right? His report card every Monday in the paper was must read for everybody in Boston. And beyond him, growing up in Boston, I loved reading all these great long form writers, columnists. Jackie McMullen was phenomenal. Will McDonough was phenomenal. I mean, I always believed that the Boston Globe sports section was at one point the greatest sports section in America, because there was so much great writing in those papers. And those guys were not afraid to kind of take stances on stuff. They would write, profiles when they had to, but they were not afraid to take a strong opinion on whatever topic it may be. When you're a newsbreaker, I think you lose the ability to do some of that, because you are making relationships with people. You want to make sure you're not too tough on a certain guy at a certain time. That's why Woj's ability to write what he was writing, whether it was about LeBron or anybody else, and still break all this news, I think is one of the great needle threads in sports reporting history. But for me, I got to SI. I wanted to be a feature writer like a Jack McCallum or an Ian Thompson or a Chris Ballard. And then as the internet kind of grew, I was like, I want to be a sharp column writer like some of the guys I grew up reading, like Dan Shaughnessy and others today.
Did Woj try to recruit you to ESPN?
So the way that was framed to me was like, Woj had a job and everybody could have had a job with him, right? Like he wasn't going to go to ESPN and leave everybody behind. The difference for me is that in addition to working at Yahoo, I had my hands in a whole lot of other different pies, right?
Yeah.
I had at that time, I had a full-time radio show at that time with NBC Sports Radio. I was doing 5 days a week from 3 to 6 every single day while I was working. I was also doing some boxing broadcasting at that time with NBC. So, ESPN, it's changed a lot in the last 10 years, but at that time, you were either ESPN and you're not. You couldn't do other things outside. So it never made any sense to me economically, opportunity-wise. So, all the guys that wanted to go, and most of them did, several of them did, they had an opportunity, probably made good money and went. It just logistically, it didn't make any sense for me.
How was working with Shams? How does he compare to Woj?
I mean, they're very similar in that they are just tireless, right? Like most people for years, I've spent days with my alerts set for Woj and Shams, and everything from the news they break themselves to news that breaks kind of organically through a press release or whatever, they're right on it, right on the top of it, and right in the middle of it. I always admired from a very young age, and we started working with Shams, I think when he was still in college, when he was his first worked at Yahoo, just how dedicated he was to that craft. And we would spend a lot of nights in that Yahoo newsroom in New York. And, Woj would be there, and sometimes Shams was there. And I mean, they would just be sitting there glued to their phones, getting things broken one by one. He'd break one, Shams would break another, sometimes it'd go the other way. They're very similar when it comes to that work ethic, which in that type of job is really all that matters.
Do you think that Shams will be comfortable at ESPN for a long time? Like he's bounced around a lot, mostly by his own doing. And I do wonder if if he does or will ever mind kind of just almost living in Woj's shadow. Yeah,
it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think ESPN's probably out there as the company that can pay him the most, which is always the most important thing. I also think that it feels like the way the NBA is setting up in the years to come, that there may be fewer breaking stories, big stories, than there have been in the past. There's always going to be news. The draft is always going to be a big night for any newsbreaker out there. But you think about the rules that the league has created. Like these rules are basically saying don't do trades, right? It's let's have a second apron, a first apron. You can only take X dollars back. You can't deal draft picks after a certain number of years. Like the NBA is they want their teams built organically. So while you will still have, one or two big deals a year, the trade deadline, I think, is going to get a lot more difficult for teams to make deals around. And even the offseason, signings will always be out there, but you're starting to see a lot of players sign extensions early on because nobody wants to take a chance on hitting free agency and having a bunch of teams hard capped or in the second apron, not able to offer them, what they were hoping for. So there could be kind of a twist in the value maybe of news breaking because the NBA is determined to make these teams build out their rosters organically.
Woj is only 55 years old. I think everybody has an ego. I know you wrote he had no interest in the Karl Anthony Towns news, but 2, 3, 5 years from now, can you see him wanting to get back in the NBA spotlight?
Not into the NBA spotlight. He did open the door to do something else. I don't know what that something else would be. I think he's done with reporting.
Yeah,
I do believe that. Now, if after 4 or 5 years at St. Bonaventure and building St. Bonaventure into the kind of program that he hopes it can be, could another bigger program potentially lure him away? Maybe. As I wrote in the story, like Dusty May at Michigan, kicked the tires on Woj coming there. Lindsey Gottlieb at USC kicked the tires on him coming there. His connections are always going to make him an elite prospect for that job, because not only can he help with raising money, which is paramount for these programs, but if you've got a kid on the fence, a kid that may not be, a top 5, top 10 pick, Woj can go to them and say, hey, I can help you get a spot on somebody's summer league. I can help you get a slot overseas somewhere. Like, this is going to be valuable to a lot of kids that want to have a career beyond just their 4 years or whatever it is at their respective schools. So if I had to guess, and at this point it is just guesswork, that if he decides to do something else, it could be at another college program. It could be working with players specifically, not exactly in an agent role necessarily, but in someone that can help a player, navigate the landscape in some kind of job. I think that would be the only thing he would do outside of this one at St. Bonaventure.
We mentioned going to Yahoo, working with Woj in the vertical for a couple of years, but you've obviously been with SI for most of your career. How is working with this version of SI under Minute Media? Have things changed for you?
Things have changed dramatically, in a incredibly positive way. We began the year, with most of us wondering if we would have jobs. When they announced that elimination, back in January, everyone was kind of scrambling and wondering how it was all going to shake out. To the credit of Minute Media and ABG, which is our real owner, like they're the ones that own us. They have figured out a solution here. And now, whereas early on in the Arena Group days, the emphasis was on churn, right? It was like, let's get 5 or 6 whatever stories out every single week. You still have to produce at this version of SI. You're still writing columns for the web. You're still podcasts. You're still doing a whole bunch of different stuff, but there's a lot more emphasis on quality as opposed to quantity. And I think if you're trying to keep a magazine alive and you're trying to write stories like the one I did on Woj and many others that some of my talented colleagues have done, in recent months, you can't just, sit down and write that thing in a couple hours, right? Yeah. Like, it takes time to report it out. It takes time to write it. And, Minute Media and this ownership group have given, me and other writers a lot of room to breathe when it comes to stuff like this. So I can tell you the entire staff is, wildly optimistic about the future of this place because of what Minute Media has done coming in.
What were those first few weeks and months like when it was just the future of SI was so uncertain earlier this year, and there were those mass layoffs? Like, were you sitting back just waiting, or were you trying to see if there were other opportunities out there for you away from SI?
I had some, my agent talked to me about a couple of other different opportunities, but there was a long runway before SI was going to be, quote, eliminated, that the staff was going to be laid off. I think it was all the way into April. So we had like 3 months, and maybe I was being naive, pie in the sky. But at that time, I just kept thinking, like, there's no way someone's going to let SI die, right? That just wasn't going to happen. And part of it was, blind optimism. But also part of it was we had an owner in ABG that, that licensed out our intellectual property. It would only hurt them if SI went away, if the staff was gutted and tossed aside. So I just had some optimism that something was going to happen. Someone was going to come along and figure this thing out. It worked out better than I and most probably ever would have dreamed, having an owner that came in and brought back, I think, 90% of the staff and made the commitment with resources like Minute Media has done. But I didn't panic all that much in the first couple of months, mostly because I just believed that something was going to change. This idea of just eliminating the magazine and cutting all the staff. I know it's happened at other places and it's terrible, but I just didn't believe that at this point in time it could happen at SI.
What was working for SI like when you started there back in 2004?
Yeah, I got there out of college in 2003. I think it was 2003. Yeah. And like, I got there as a fact checker, right? Which was a phenomenal job in that version of SI at the time. You work 4 days a week. You really kind of only work 2 days a week because magazines closed on Sunday and Monday. So Thursday, Friday, I kind of came into the office, whatever, messed around a little bit, talked to different editors, went to the bars in New York afterwards, and then waited till Sunday when most of the copy came in on Sunday, because weekly everybody files kind of on Sunday morning, and you spend all day Sunday working. Sometimes it would be till 11, 12 o'clock at night. And then Monday you'd probably do a little bit more of the same. So it was a great first job out there. And you learn a lot. Like, I'm grateful that I didn't have to write immediately, because looking back at some of even the early copy that I produced, it wasn't very good. Like, I needed to learn how to write without writing. And I was able to do that as a fact checker, kind of fact checking Jack McCallum stuff and Ian Thompson stuff and Chris Ballard stuff, and just learning how these guys reported stories, learning the structure of an SI story, which always includes like, so I always love the SI leads. It's why I kind of worked hard on the Woj story to have a lead that kind of jumped off the page a little bit with him in that bar. It takes time to learn how to do that. And I'm grateful to have had, 2 or 3 years of just being a fact checker and learning that. And look, I'm not the only one. Like, for a long time, most of the people or the writers that SI produced came from that bullpen, that group of fact checkers. I mean, Chris Ballard was in there. John Wertheim was in there. Like, a lot of people were produced out of that bullpen. Ben Ryder, I could name a million of guys that were there when I was there. So, it was a great opportunity to kind of learn without exposing yourself and making a lot of mistakes that I probably would have made had I not been given that kind of runway.
You mentioned having the radio show for NBC. When Dan Patrick announced that his retirement was coming in 2027, you kind of jokingly threw your name in the hat to be Dan's replacement. Is that a job that would actually appeal to you? Like, would you be interested in getting back into full-time radio?
I don't know. I mean, I'm obviously kidding with Dan. Like, I do that because, his top producer, Paul Pabst, and I are neighbors in Vermont. We both have houses up there. And Dan actually has a house, I think, still up there. And I love that setup. I mean, I remember doing it for the first time. And the first time I did it, I co-hosted it with Seth Davis. And they asked me back a week later, and I was like, great, who's the co-host? They're like, no, you're going to do it yourself. And I had done zero radio at that point. I had done nothing. And I remember sitting in that chair for the first time, just being petrified. But working with those guys behind the glass, like, they just made it became like a conversational radio show over 4 hours. I don't know. I'd like to ride this kind of Sports Illustrated wave as long as possible. Like, if this place stays in business for 20, 30 more years, I hope to still be a senior writer there for 20, 30 more years, because I just live for, writing these kind of features that I think are starting to go away as magazines have gone away. The emphasis is more on video. The emphasis is more on shorter stuff. And I get all that. It's where the money is, but I still like to, whether it's picking up my iPad or picking up a physical magazine, to read some real long pieces. I mean, like, my writing process is the same every damn time. Like, I start off like a story with all my notes and everything, and I get nowhere for like 2 days. And then I start reading other people's stories. Like, I'm a big fan of Zach Barron over at GQ. I read his stories. I read every SI I've been able to accumulate over the years. I read John Wertheim's story on Jokic. What am I saying his name? The tennis player, Djokovic. I read that like 7 times before I started writing, just to kind of remember what good writing ultimately is. And then you kind of get into it. You kind of get like, they become like a muse for you in some way. So I still like doing that kind of stuff. And I hope there's still a place for it over the next, 15, 20 years. And I'm fortunate enough to get to do it.
I was just thinking how, there was essentially a funeral for SI earlier this year. Like, everybody had considered it to be dead before it did. It was revived. And then inside the NBA, you were one of the first people who said, when it became clear that TNT was going to lose the NBA, you were one of the first people that said inside the NBA doesn't necessarily have to end because of that. And now it looks like you might be right. ESPN reaching a deal to license inside the NBA. Have you heard anything else about that deal beyond what's been reported?
No, I think they're from what I hear, they are kind of crossing the T's and dotting the I's on some of the contracts there, like individual contracts with talent on that set. But my understanding is it will be the full team out there. And look, it's an interesting, parallel there with SI and inside the NBA.
Yeah.
I feel the exact same way. Like with SI, I'm like, it's too big a brand. It still means something. It's just not going to be, stuffed in a drawer and sent away forever. Similar with inside the NBA. It's like, all right, Turner's losing its broadcast rights, but you have 3 other entities out there, 2 of which are brand new, at least in modern times, to basketball. NBC hasn't had rights for decades. Amazon never did. Somebody's going to want this show. Now, did I think it was going to play out where ESPN got it? No, I mean, that was interesting to me that ESPN absorbed or is absorbing inside the NBA. But the idea that show, which is insanely good and wildly popular, would just be gone. All these guys would kind of go their separate ways. That just never made any kind of logical sense to me.
Yeah. And then the only thing that still just kind of concerns me on that is just the fact that Charles Barkley was so vocal over the summer about wanting to keep the show together and wanting to keep the on-air crew and the behind the scenes cast, everybody together. And it almost seems weird that he's not like as loudly celebrating the news that it looks like the show is going to be kept together. But maybe
he changed his mind. Like Charles, I mean, how many times has Charles said, "I'm retiring. I'm not."
Oh yeah. No,
I'm out.
It's daily.
He can't help himself. Like I'm fascinated to see what inside the NBA looks like while on ESPN, because they're going to take so many shots at ESPN.
Yeah.
Like they're going to, anything goofy that ESPN does, it's going to be out there. I do hope ESPN kind of leaves the show alone. Like lets the producers do their thing, lets the talent do their thing. Like it's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And there's nothing wrong with inside the NBA from top to bottom. So I hope it remains the same great show that it always is. Charles, to me, like, I know he doesn't need the money, but he would just get so bored if he wasn't doing this.
Yeah.
And that's why I think he'll be one of those guys you got to wheel out of there at some point. All of them will, because they're so passionate about doing this particular show.
Right. Well, even think about how much he talks about, he's excited at the end of every NBA season and wants to go on summer vacation. And he talks about wanting to get away from work and stuff. And like the next day he's doing multiple interviews. Like he just every single day over the summer, he's doing another.
He's crazy. Like I remember, like, where was I? It was like, we might've been like Oklahoma City on one playoff trip, and he was there and he was just sitting at the bar talking to random people who come up to him and talk basketball. Like this is just what he does. And he's extremely well compensated for it. He could probably wind up getting with even more money on whatever new deal that he's going to be eyeballing. Like I think this show is going to be together for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. What was it like being a Celtics ball boy?
Best college job you could ever have, because I got the job when I was a freshman in high school. My father, who was a police officer in Boston, my old boss with the Celtics, the first boss I had there, he liked having cops' kids work for him. I assume it's because he would, in case he ever got in any trouble, he would have, a variety of different potential fixes out there for him. So somebody with connection to him, asked my father, was like, "Hey, you got any kids that like basketball?" And my father's like, "Yeah, I got one. I'm older than my brother." And I started that job when I was a freshman in high school, was kind of mopping up the floor when the guys finished their free throws, doing all that. Where it got really fun was when I got a little bit older, and I got assigned to work the visiting locker room. Now, the visiting locker room is kind of like an entity unto itself. You're a country within a country in there, and that's where you can make the real money, because guys come in and they get through the game, and a lot of them want booze. A lot of them want to meet women. I've lost count the number of times that a player on the bench would send me up into the stands this is before Instagram and all that stuff, to get a girl's phone number. And I would do it because, at the end of the night, I would walk out of there with $200-300, and $200-300 for a kid at Boston College, that goes a long way. That buys a lot of Bud Light at BC. So I would, it was a phenomenal job. The only downside was I was there through some very lean years. Like I didn't see a lot of playoff games. I got there in, I believe, 95, which was the first year I got there last year of ML Carr, and then the Rick Pitino era, which was bad. The Jim O'Brien era was better. They had that great run to the conference finals. Paul Pierce, Antoine Walker, those years. But the only downside was not the kind of team success that my brother experienced now. I got to hire my brother about 4 years after I took that job. My brother's still there. He's the equipment manager for the team now. So that was fun, getting to work that visiting locker room with him and seeing him, grow into that job and become a big part of what they do on a daily basis.
Were there any players that you kind of developed almost like a friendship with?
Yeah, there were a lot of them. I'm trying to think who I was closest with. I mean, Paul Pierce, definitely. It's funny. Like that relationship also helped me when I wrote the story on him leaving ESPN a couple of years ago. I seem to write a lot about people leaving ESPN. He was great. And we were kind of around the same age. I mean, there were guys I wouldn't say I was friends with, but guys that when they came into town, they knew my face and they knew I could get stuff for them. Like if you needed like a 6-pack or a bottle of booze or whatever, I was your guy. I would go up the street. I would go and get it. My favorite story of all time though is it was like the 2002 playoffs when the Celtics played the Sixers in the second round. And that was the Allen Iverson, Dikembe Mutombo Sixers team after they had been to the finals the first year after. And the Celtics knocked them off. And after the game, Allen Iverson, said to me, like, I need you to go get me a whole bunch of booze. Gave me like $2,000 or something like that in cash. Get whatever you want. Get a bunch of Coronas, all this stuff. So the only liquor store near TD Garden is, like a quarter mile away. You got to go up Causeway Street, up and down a hill. So I grab one of those hand trucks and I take another one of the ball boys with me. And I push the hand truck up the hill. It's fine. Get there, get all the beer, bring it in. Coming back down the hill, though, the game had just let out. So here's me, some skinny 21-year-old, trying to defend like a cart full of beer from a bunch of Celtics fans that are still thirsty for booze. So I was able to get most of them into the Garden. But then you're bringing the stuff up the stairs, and the Celtics just won the series. So they're coming down the stairs, and they start pulling 30-packs off the thing. Paul Pierce, Tony Battie, guys like that are pulling 30s off the rack. By the time it got to the Sixers bus, I forget how many was left, but it was a fraction of what Allen Iverson paid for in that moment. I remember it giving me kind of this quizzical look like, this is what my money got me. And I'm like, I'm sorry, man. It was the very best that I could do. But I've got a lot of guys would know me, would say, hey, I need you to get this for me, get me set up with different stuff. And that was able to turn into a nice little cottage industry for me after games.
Are you still able to be a Celtics fan as a journalist and reporter? Not
at all. Because now, part of my side jobs is to do pre and post game for NBC Sports Boston. It's not like it's hard to explain. And you probably get some of this, like that the fandom kind of dies right, when it comes to basketball. Basketball and boxing, the two sports that I cover, it just kind of goes away. You don't have any feelings one way or the other. And I'm kind of like a lot of reporters now where the team I root for, especially like the finals, right? Like whatever team wins game one of that series, I'm now rooting for them because that would get the finals over quicker. Like I want to be over. If there's a Boston Lakers series, like I'm rooting not to take that last flight, in the middle of June to whatever coast that ultimately be going to. I'm really, when it comes to Boston sports, the only team I have like a fandom for now is like the Red Sox. Cause in the summer I get a little bit of time off. I go to Fenway. I don't have any idea who's playing for this team. All I get is what I read from Shaughnessy and how now they're cheap and they can't get Juan Soto. But I like that. Like, I like not knowing, the nitty gritty about the team. And I'm able to just kind of root for the laundry a little bit when I'm off in the summer.
How are you received by Celtics fans?
It depends on what I've written or said on any given night. I mean, look, it's Boston sports fans in general that are tough, man.
Yeah.
Like they're as passionate as they come. I'd put the Garden up against any arena in the NBA when it comes to crowd noise, especially in the playoffs. They're loyal though. So if you start talking about one of their guys or the way a team's playing in a negative light, they'll jump all over you. Say you're too negative. If you're on the Celtics broadcast, you'll be talking more positive about the Celtics. But when I'm on the broadcast, I do try to keep that in mind, right? That I'm on the pre and post game show of the Celtics affiliate. But at the same time, I'm also there as a writer for Sports Illustrated, and I've got to try to be as objective as as I possibly can. So it's in Boston. There's never a lot of positive reaction to pundits out there.
How is Bill Simmons received by Celtics fans? And I ask that because, like, I know Cowboys fans don't they don't like or claim Skip Bayless, despite Skip Bayless saying that, you know, he is the biggest Cowboys fan that there is. So do Celtics fans, do they love Bill Simmons, or is he their Skip Bayless?
No, I don't think there's a parallel there. I'm not entirely sure because I never really thought about it in that way. But my read on it is that is a lot more positive response for Bill than negative. I mean, one thing about Boston, one thing about Boston is that it's a very parochial town, right? Like when you're from there, they may hate on you at times, but they know when you're from there. Like you can't be kind of an outsider and penetrate the sort of the TV wall or the journalism wall there. I mean, whether it's Mike Gorman doing that job forever, Tommy Heinsohn did that job forever. Now Scalabrine, who has Boston roots as well, part of that. Like it's just, you know, they may hate on you from time to time, but generally speaking, if you're from there, they'll acknowledge that and they'll appreciate you for that.
I know a couple weeks ago, I think it was with Rich Eisen, you said you were talking about the Tyson Paul fight for the last time, but I'm going to ask you to talk about it one more time, because you were one of the people who were very confident that that Tyson had no chance of winning that fight. How were you able to not be fooled by the social media clips of Tyson training that made him look like this ferocious 35-year-old boxer?
You know, it really just years of covering the sport and being in gyms and really seeing how age affects fighters. I'm not talking about a 58-year-old. I'm talking about guys that are in their mid-30s, early 40s that are trying to keep a career going and how slow they become. Now, if you had shown me a sparring session of Mike Tyson for 3 rounds, just 3 rounds, and he was doing all that, I would have bought it. We've been all in. But all I ever saw, and all the public ever saw, was a bunch of 30-second clips at most of Tyson just rocketing his body at his trainer. That to me, it never sold me that Mike Tyson was going to be competitive in this fight. I also remember just a few years earlier, the absolute beating that a 58-year-old Evander Holyfield took. He fought a guy named Vitor Belfort in another exhibition. And Holyfield, who for years was known as a guy with a great chin. I mean, went the distance with Foreman, Tyson, fought all the greats at heavyweight. Didn't last, a couple of rounds, or maybe it was 1 round with Vitor Belfort. So the idea that Mike Tyson, who, for the record, was bad when he was an active boxer at the very end. The last 4 or 5 years of Tyson's career, he was mediocre. He was getting beat by some guys that in his prime would never have stood a chance against him. Kevin McBride was his last real loss. Even though Jake Paul is not a big-time boxer. He's a professional, but even though he's not a big-time boxer, he still is disciplined enough, big enough, strong enough to avoid those 10, 15-second rushes from Tyson and then do some damage after the fact. Like how the first 30 seconds of that fight went was exactly how I thought it was going to go. You were going to see Mike Tyson, almost like a video game character, like take his power level down to 0. He was going to go all out, rush, try to land some shots. I thought Jake looked a little bit shaky in those first 30, 45 seconds. But after that run was over, Mike had nothing left. He was a 58-year-old grandfather who has not taken great care of his body internally over the years. All the muscles, all the training videos in the world was never going to convince me that Mike Tyson was going to be able to be successful against Jake Paul. I was like encouraging, and I don't encourage, I kind of do as I do gambling picks on my podcast. But like I was telling people, like, take Jake by decision. Hello, take Jake by decision. Like that was the most likely outcome of that fight. And sure enough, that's exactly how it played out.
I saw where Michael Irvin had said that that he heard in Tyson's contract that he wasn't allowed to throw an uppercut punch. Is there any truth to that?
Let's produce that contract. I'd like to see some I also saw the Word docs that made its rounds on the internet of the script that was supposedly out there for Tyson, Jake Paul. This is part of the problem with not having enough kind of journalists in boxing, right? Like, boxing used to be, it used to be every major outlet had a boxing writer. Remember the 80s, 90s? I think SI for years had like 2, for a long time. Now you've got some good websites that are out there, but there isn't a lot of boxing journalism that's there. Instead, you get Michael Irvin, who probably read something on Twitter that said that Mike Tyson couldn't throw an uppercut, and winds up blasting that out to a wide audience. You have people reposting. I think Joe Rogan was one of the guys that put that script that was out there that on the internet and saying that's proof that this fight was rigged from the start. It was not rigged. It was just a 58-year-old who had nothing left going up against a 27-year-old. That is a lot better than some people tend to give him credit for. Like the idea that Mike Tyson is like, frankly, sophisticated enough to like pull his punches at certain times, to not throw uppercuts at certain times. Like Jake Paul sticking his tongue out is like some sort of secret code to Mike to not throw a particular punch. Like this is like JFK level conspiracy stuff that's going out there. But because not enough people understand boxing and get boxing, and frankly, this is one of the few times that most people, probably including Michael Irvin, that watched boxing.
Yeah.
The fact that's the case leads to crazy conspiracy theory stuff like this.
So was the fight good or bad for boxing because of all these reactions? Like obviously it got a lot of attention and a lot of people were watching it, but the aftermath of just everybody walking away from that, just saying how bad the fight was this ultimately a good thing or bad thing for boxing?
I think ultimately it's a good thing because of the exposure the undercard guys got, right? Like I called the first Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano fight for DAZN, which was electric. That was one of the best crowds I've ever experienced at Madison Square Garden. An incredibly competitive fight, a majority decision win for Katie Taylor. Like I've been waiting years for those two to get together for the rematch. And the truth is, without Jake Paul and Mike Tyson kind of putting up the cash to make that fight happen, we might not have gotten the rematch of Taylor and Serrano. There were 1.5 million people that watched on DAZN the first fight. Now, I don't know anything about the numbers Netflix is throwing out there. I'm you're more versed in that stuff than I am. I'm guessing it's not 50 million, but it's a lot bigger than 1.5 million. It's a big number that watched Taylor against Serrano. And because of that, I think boxing's better off for it. On a lesser degree, Mario Barrios was in a good fight. Mario Barrios is a title holder who's going to be in a big fight either later this year, probably early next year. People got exposed to Mario Barrios and his brand of fighting. So, like, the fight itself was goofy, but all the exposure that the undercard people got, I think ultimately that's good for boxing.
And what about Jake Paul? Is he good for the sport of boxing?
I think he's great because he does stuff like this. Like, Jake Paul and I and his team didn't see eye to eye on this Tyson fight. I had several unpleasant text exchanges with his people over the last 6 months because I did every interview I did. I said the same thing. I'm like, don't think this is going to be a good fight. Stop buying into this Mike Tyson hype. But overall, I think Jake has been great for the sport because he's coming in and, with HBO and Showtime when they were there, now with DAZN, like they have certain slots, right? They have fight dates, 15 per year or whatever that number may be. Jake Paul's not taking any of those slots. He's doing independent pay-per-views that, wouldn't exist unless he was ultimately fighting on them. On top of that, he is putting real fighters on the undercard and getting real fighters exposure and getting real fighters paid. I mean, Amanda Serrano has made millions during her couple of years working with Jake Paul after toiling in obscurity prior to that. On a lesser degree, Montana Love is someone that got a big contract because of Jake Paul. Shadesha Green is a women's fighter getting opportunities because of Jake Paul. Jake Paul right now is propping up women's boxing, which I think is a net positive overall for the sport. So I don't think Jake Paul is going to be a world champion. I don't think he's going to, increase his abilities beyond kind of what they already are. His best course for the next, 12 months is probably to fight KSI, the YouTuber out in the UK, and then maybe Tommy Fury, another fight with him, who handed Jake his only loss. These aren't real fights necessarily, but whenever he fights, real fighters going to be on the card. Real fighters going to get paid. Real fighters going to get exposure. And if you're a boxing fan and can't see that, well, then I think you're not able to see the forest through the trees.
Before we finish up, I wanted to ask you about sort of infamously saying the Denver Nuggets are not interesting, and then the Nuggets went on to win
another
the
Rich
NBA
Eisen
Finals.
Specialty, right?
Yeah. I think that kind of broaches a larger question of does the NBA have a problem because so many of its best players are in small markets like Jokic, Giannis, Wembanyama, Luka, Anthony Edwards. Is this the fact that these star players are in small markets? Is it contributing to the declining NBA ratings?
I don't think that is contributing to the decline in ratings. I think a bigger problem the NBA has is that this 3-point centric style of play is hard to watch.
Yeah.
It's really hard to watch. And this year, and I'm kind of giving away some stuff I'm going to be writing, probably the next couple of weeks. Like the proliferation of the 3-point shot is getting out of control. I mean, the Celtics are going to shatter the record for most threes attempted per game in the season. Right now, it's like around 45. The Mike D'Antoni Rockets did it a couple of times. The Celtics are over 50. I think there's 8 teams right now that are averaging 40 or more threes per game. There's about 3 teams where it's either at 50% or close to it of their average shots per game are 3-pointers. And I get the analytics of it, but I watch some of these games and it's like 1 3 after another, and not even good threes, right? Like it's dribble up, take a 3, miss, dribble up, take a 3. There's a clip I saw going around social media of a Suns-Lakers game. You probably saw that too, like where it's like an entire 5-minute stretch of just bad 3-pointers. People don't want to watch that. So, when I saw the last ratings come out back in November and the NBA tried to contribute that to, the election and some of the stuff that was going on in the world, I don't buy that. I think the style of play is hurting the league, the perception of the league. I think that that the grassroots fans that want to see good basketball being played are getting turned off more and more by this style of play. I think it's something the league has to look at doing something about. I don't know if you change up the rules. Like I've floated to a couple of coaches this idea of, putting a cap on the number of made threes per game, right? Like let's say you can make 15 threes per game. After that, everything counts as a 2, right? Like maybe that's a little drastic, but something's got to change because the 3-point shooting isn't. Like I was watching the Memphis Grizzlies warm up, recently, and I'm watching Zach Edey shooting threes. Like, did Zach Edey take a 3 during his time in college? Like, that's a big man, one of the bigger big men in that rookie class. Like, and he's out there trying to become a 3-point shooter, and I get it. Like, that's where the game has gone. 7-footers now have to be 3-point shooters to have long careers. I think the NBA though has got to do something about it because the more 3-pointers get introduced into the game, I think there will be a direct correlation to viewership. I think there'll be less viewers that want to watch these games.
Do you think the NBA internally is acknowledging that it's a problem?
I don't think they like it. I don't know if they'd call it a problem just yet. And I sure know they don't have a solution for it at the moment. But I think this could kind of be the year where they recognize that it is a problem. Because if we finish with the Celtics averaging 52 threes a game, the Warriors at 46, 47, 8 or 9 teams at 40 plus, it's not a blip on the radar. It's a trend. I mean, like Joe Mazzulla in Boston, if every shot his team could take would be a 3, he'd be happy. Like that's just kind of his mindset. And he has analytics guys that back him up. And right now, teams aren't built like the Celtics, but every team is trying to be built like the Celtics. The Oklahoma City Thunder are like a facsimile of Boston, where you have a bunch of versatile wing guys that shoot threes and can defend multiple positions. Every team is striving to build a team that looks like that. So, 50 threes per game, it could be 55 next year. There could be 2 teams averaging more than 50 threes per game. It's just going to keep growing and growing. And I personally think the NBA has got to look hard at finding a way to stop it.
Last thing, how do you think JJ Redick's rookie season as an NBA head coach is going?
Not great. I mean, statistically, he's a game behind Darvin Ham was at this time last year. I've kind of ebbed and flowed on JJ a little bit. I do think his approach to the season was a smart one. He put an emphasis on getting organized, right?
Yeah.
Like making sure everybody was on the same page, not just the starting 5, but 1 to 15. Everybody knew their job. And I do think that was something that was lacking with that team last year. But it's disturbing, man, to see a team look like it's quit as often as it has. I mean, that Miami game was a debacle. And what they're 3-7 as we record this in their last 10. Their only 3 wins have come against Utah, Portland, and San Antonio. They probably should have lost that Utah game.
Yep.
With that timeout that was called late by Will Hardy. that worries me. Like, is the coach getting through? Is the message getting through when we're in early December and a team is no-showing a road game like they did against Miami? And they had, kind of no-showed some halves. There was a second half against Denver at home that they no-showed against. Like that to me would be concerning. I do think he has great qualities to be a head coach. He's got really good assistants on his bench and Scott Brooks and Nate McMillan. But when I see a team not showing effort, to me, that is a reflection on the coach.
Chris, you were great. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. And the Woj piece was tremendous.
I appreciate that.
That is Chris Mannix. I'm Brandon Contes. This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Please rate and subscribe to this podcast. Please also subscribe to Awful Announcing's YouTube page. But regardless of how you consume Awful Announcing and the Awful Announcing Podcast, thanks for listening and be good.
Thanks for listening to the Awful Announcing Podcast. For the latest news spanning the sports media landscape and more, check out awfulannouncing.com and follow us at Awful Announcing.